So in case, I'm going to encourage you, if you have any questions, comments, or anything for me after this session, please email me. That's my Gmail address, srj, my initials, .susanjohnson@gmail. I have a website, Thriving Amidst Chaos, that has some articles on it, short articles I wrote, some of which are related to, all of them are related to academic work. So for other topics, you might want to take a look there. So we're going to focus on project work today, and in particular, writing, which is always a high priority in your, if you're an academician. But before we get into all of this, I want to just say a little bit more about what I mean by project, because it's not always obvious. So a project is any concrete outcome that you're trying to achieve that requires time and tasks. Some of you, if any of you are familiar with the Getting Things Done system of time management and organization, this term is kind of a key element of that project, or of that approach. So it's something that has a deliverable. So with that in mind, here's a story from a coaching session that I had just before the pandemic. Actually, I was called by a mid-career early associate professor, clinical physician researcher who did educational research. And she had been to a couple of my workshops and called and said, I have so many things going on right now, and I just need some help getting organized because I want to be promoted here in the next couple of years. So we agreed to meet, and I went to her office. And because she knew kind of what I would have recommended, I said, well, let's look at your project list first. And she looked at me, and she looked down, and she opened up that middle drawer of her desk and pulled out this legal pad. Blank. She had no project list. And so in the next probably 15 minutes, we worked on making a list for her of all the current projects that she was currently active. And you could just see her mind clear. And we spent the rest of the time figuring out which of those needed to be done now and which could be done later. And for the ones that were soon, how would she get started on them? And using that approach over the next several months, she made tremendous progress without hardly any additional help from me, and subsequently was promoted, I think, in the next promotion cycle. So my first recommendation is to, when you figure out what your projects are, keep a list of them in one place so you can look at them all together. When you do that, it gives you a much better sense of how to prioritize. It'll help you keep on track of deadlines if you keep the due date incorporated into the name of the project. And if you see that whole list there, when someone says to you, would you like to take on this new work, you can see right away that you may be fully booked or not, and it can help you make decisions about what you should say yes and no to. So if you're only going to take one thing away from this whole session, keeping a list is the core strategy in figuring out not only what you're going to do, but when you're going to do it. Okay, so to make your own project list, there are some obvious academic projects. Remember, we're looking for concrete deliverables. So a paper or a grant, a talk that you're preparing, a new curriculum if you're doing educational work. Those are all obvious projects and on the academic side, but the concept is much broader than that. And so anytime you have to plan something, prepare something, learn something, decide something, fix something, buy something, any verb that has a project or a concrete object at the end, that's a project. So here's some examples: planning a conference, or better yet, a vacation, preparing for a recertification exam, learning how to make sourdough bread, which I know I must have made this slide during the pandemic. I failed, by the way. I did not learn how to make sourdough bread. Deciding whether you should apply for a new job or position within your current job, fixing something, buying something, making something, whatever it is, those are all projects. To give you some help in identifying what yours are, most projects are related to either a role that you have or a goal that you have, roles and goals. And so if you make a list of your roles, so let's say, for example, you're a parent, clinical service director, the chair of a committee, the director of a lab, those are all roles that you have. Or goals, you want to be fit, have a well-funded lab, be recognized as a leader, those are goals. And to accomplish any goal, you'll be completing a series of projects, right? To have a well-funded lab, a grant, another grant, a getting bridge funding to get you through until you can get another grant. Those are all projects. And on the role side, every role will occasionally have a project associated with it. So let's say you're a clinical service director, and the project, that's not a project. Instead, it's a responsibility, a role. And a project might come up if you're asked by the hospital director to create a new clinical service. So the creation of that new service within your area would be a project. So I hope that that's clear. So look at your roles and goals and start making a list of everything that you're currently working on. So with that in mind, let's talk about a framework for how to allocate time to your highest priority projects. This especially, of course, applies to writing, because that's the hardest thing to fit into the busy every day that you all have, regardless of what your job responsibilities are. And I'll say right now, there's no one way to do this. So if anybody says to you, this is the only way to do it, you should probably move on to another recommender. Because there are a variety of different techniques, and you have to figure out what works best in your current work situations. So hopefully this will give you enough ideas to start to develop your own plan. Now, the problem, of course, with with writing in particular, is the belief that you need a large block of uninterrupted time before you can do any work on that project or manuscript. It's nice to have large blocks of uninterrupted time, and those are perfectly fine to use, of course, but you know that it's rare to be able to have those. And so there must be another way. And so we'll talk about what that way might be. Now, the outcome of that belief that you have to have a big block of time is one of the two scenarios shown here. I hope you'll appreciate that this is a hand drawn by me graphic, which is why I became a gynecologist and not a graphic designer. I think that's clear. So the first scenario is when you have something with a deadline. And so what happens there when you fall into the big block of time myth is you end up doing everything at the last minute, because those times just rarely occur. And then you have to stop everything else and finish and sometimes start from scratch. The second scenario, though, is actually more worrisome, because most of you are, you have your job because you've been successful at a certain level. And so this deadline-driven approach may work pretty well, but it's stressful. And it may actually not turn out to produce the best work, because if you wait until the last minute, you don't really have time to fully develop your ideas and produce the best possible product. The second scenario is the one that I see as being more deadly, if you will. And that is when you have a project the most important thing you do academically is not write grants. I know it feels like that sometimes. It's to write papers. The whole purpose of this exercise is to create new knowledge. And if those papers never get written, then the grant was for naught. And when something doesn't have a deadline, many of us don't have a good way to get ourselves to actually do the work. And so in my career as an academic administrator, where I've overseen the whole annual review and promotion process for the whole College of Medicine and for the whole university, I know perfectly well that lots of people have a lot of unwritten data and ideas sitting around in their desk. So for both of these reasons, you have to come up with a better approach. Now, there's no question that although this has to happen if you're going to be successful, it isn't easy. And I love this quote from Cal Newport, who you might know if you've seen his book, heard of his book, or read it, Deep Work. Cal is a computer science professor at Georgetown, and is highly productive in his own arena, and has also had a career since he was in graduate school writing books, mostly about productivity related topics. And this one is the one that most academics are familiar with. It's basically all about how to think about finding time to do deep thinking. And this is what he says about writing. If you want to successfully integrate more writing into your professional life, you can't just wait until you find yourself with lots of free time and in the mood to concentrate. You have to actively fight to incorporate this into your schedule. So that's the second most important slide I've shown you. Keep a list of your projects and take on the view that this is something you actually have to work hard at, and to keep the distractions and other stuff away. Okay, so here Some of you may have already, attended a workshop or read some articles, good articles on the idea of how you should, the best way to do academic writing, which is the generally recommended approach now is to do a little bit every day. We'll come back to that later. I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. I don't have any stake in what method is best, but I've tried to figure out from reading and talking to people what options work. And out of that, I've come up with a slightly different framework, which I think is helpful. And the core of it is that you need to be prepared to work on your writing project or any other project, no matter how much time you end up having in the day or the week. So preparation is the first step, and then taking advantage of time that becomes available to you, as well as time that you plan in advance. So it applies to all of those kinds of things. Okay, so this is arbitrary to some extent, but I think for me, it makes kind of common sense that there are kind of these three ways of thinking about chunks of time. A little bit, 5 or 10 minutes, a little bit more, 30 to 60 minutes. So not a lot, but still time that you can imagine doing something meaningful, and big chunks of time. So more than an hour or two. So I'm going to talk about how you can use each one of these in a writing project. So the 10 minutes or less may seem to you as if that would be like impossible. How could you possibly work on a writing project in 10 minutes? Well, it turns out that you can. Obviously any task can, many tasks can be of any sort can be done here, but every writing project has tasks. You have to look up a reference, you have to edit a paragraph. You have an idea about, and an idea occurs to you and you want to write it down about something about what you're going to put in your manuscript. All of those things are a part of the writing process. And so capturing and doing that work will move you along. What you're really trying to do is keep the project moving along and not let it lie fallow for a long period of time. And these little bits of time that you spend, in addition to the actual work that gets done, it keeps that project top of mind. And your brain actually has the ability, what it does is it primes your brain to keep thinking about that work, and that will help you come up with more ideas and make your longer writing sections more productive. I thought of one analogy, which is seeding clouds to get rain. So if you drop seeds into whatever these seeds are into cloud, that makes the rain go. And so what we're doing with these little 10 minutes here and there is we're seeding our brains to come up with, so that better ideas will come up. The 30 to 60 minute time can be done to do a small chunk of any project, but for writing, people sometimes really, really question whether or not this approach can work. So there's a fair amount of evidence, starting with the work of Robert Boyce 30 years ago, where he showed that people who wrote for the equivalent of 30 to 45 minutes every day produced way more writing than people who did it intermittently, including people that didn't have writer's block, that this regular approach was better than waiting and doing a couple of hours a week, for example. And then there have been other actual studies. Now, if you look at the evidence, people will say, oh, this, that, and the other thing about study design, but every study that's looked at this has come up with the same results, that is writing most days will not only produce more writing, and that's more words, and that's getting closer to your final product, but it also, again, keeps the project top of mind and stimulates new ideas. So those are the reasons why moderate writing can work. Now, of course, we'd all like long chunks of time, and some of you have schedules where you can actually do this. And others of you, it's harder. So you have to decide whether this approach can work. I think what's clear to me is that if you're going to use big chunks of time, it's important to schedule them on the calendar in advance. Because if you just wait for them to show up, that's not going to happen. And there's something about having something on your calendar that makes it seem more like a meaningful, real thing. The second thing I would say here, well, so the second thing is that if you think you're going to work like a whole day or a half a day or even 3 or 4 hours, it's important to take breaks periodically. What some people say is that every 90 minutes, based on some scientific, some sort of basic science evidence, but at least every couple hours, just walk away for a few minutes, because otherwise you'll your effectiveness will drop. So time blocking would be what this is called, where you go onto your calendar in advance. Many of you have probably tried time blocking, and some of you use it successfully. Some of you have never really considered using it. It's just this idea of scheduling in advance. There are lots of challenges with keeping time blocks, which you can imagine. Distraction, having trouble getting started, being pulled away by some other work that seems more urgent at the time. What I'm going to do is just give you kind of what I think of as sort of an internal anatomy or structure of what an effective time block looks like. And then you can take it from there. So the first thing is to always have a plan for what you're going to do during that block in advance. Don't just have a block on your calendar that says write, and then expect that you will suddenly magically flow right in, go right into the flow. That won't happen. You need to plan in advance what you're going to work on. And then the second thing is to figure out a way to stay as focused as possible to avoid interruptions and distractions. And the final element is when you finish that block, if it's something you didn't actually complete, which will be mostly true for writing work, is decide what you're going to do the next time you have a long session. In other words, you want to have a revolving thing. If you have a plan, you carry it out, you make another plan. When you come back to the next session, you may be in a different place and you won't use that thing. But if you have it available, you won't ever be looking at a blank page or sitting there wondering what to do. This is a technique that Ernest Hemingway first wrote about, and he used it pretty successfully to produce many, many, many novels. The Pomodoro technique is a method that some of you may be familiar with, which is a way to help you get started and limit interruptions and know when to stop. So the Pomodoro divides time up into 25-minute work sessions followed by a short break. You can do one and move on to something else, or you can string them together. You can skip the break if you're doing several, as long as you feel like you don't need one. You just need a timepiece that will make a noise at the end. There are many, many, many Pomodoro timers available that you can get on your phone or on the internet, or you can buy a physical one like this. One that looks like a tomato, which is what Pomodoro means in Italian. So Francesco Cirillo, who invented this particular form of timing yourself, used a timer just like this, and that's why he called it the Pomodoro technique, after tomato. So here's the interruption method. So you're working along, and the dean of your medical school walks into your workspace and says, "I would like to speak with you right now." You're in the middle of writing. You pick up your tomato timer and say, "I can meet with you in 11 minutes. Could you come back then?" Interruption eliminated. What do you think? I love to do that when the dean is actually sitting in the room, because they think I'm being serious. Here's the real, of course, you're going to stop for that because you make an instant decision that that's an interruption worth taking. So the method is, whenever you get interrupted by someone else, or you interrupt yourself by thinking of something you should go off and do, you ask yourself, can this wait until the timer goes off? Your whole goal is to work through the full 25 minutes, no matter how many are left. And so you can imagine that if it's someone else that's a peer or a student or a staff member, you can say, "I'm in the middle of something. If this is not an emergency, could we get back together, make a plan, write it down, and then get back to them after, at the agreed upon time." And that technique can be generalized to any situation where you're working intensively and want to minimize interruptions. So that's the Pomodoro technique. And I'm going to, I've suggested that you need to have a plan for your project work, including writing. The times to do that are at the beginning of the week, to make a plan for what you'd like to accomplish during the week, and then what you'd like to accomplish during the day. I'm going to skip this next slide because it's really a more general process, and go on to the project work one. So most people are, if you were just managing one project, it would be easy, but none of you are doing that. You all have multiple projects, including multiple writing projects going on. So the idea at the beginning of the week is to pick a chunk of 1, 2, or maybe 3 projects that you want to try to do that week. Some writing experts recommend that you pick one that you'll devote the biggest amount of attention to, that's your primary focus for the week, and a couple of others that you can do little things to keep them moving. And that's just a framework to think about managing multiple projects. So what you might come up with is your primary is going to be to work on a manuscript. Your secondary is going to be work on a report that is due pretty soon. And then you have a presentation next week. Now, the mistake that most of us make when we make these decisions is we use work on thinking. I'm going to work on the manuscript. I'm going to work on the curriculum revision. I'm going to work on the presentation. Work on doesn't mean anything to your brain. It doesn't mean anything. You have no idea what that means. So instead, what I want you to think about doing is create a little completion goal. I'm going to complete a draft of this discussion, complete the table, find the PowerPoint deck, and which is kind of a tasky kind of thing. And then if you want to schedule time blocks at that time of the weekly plan, you can do that. Or if it's something that can be done quickly, you can just put it on your task list for the week. And finally, for the day, lots of ways to think about planning your day. But here, the key strategy that almost everyone that I recommend it to finds helpful is to make a short, highly focused list of high priority tasks that you want to get done today over and above all the other things you do. So one category is anything that has to be done today because there's an actual external deadline. And then beyond that, no more than 3 tasks that you would like to do that are important, but don't have to be done today. And my recommendation is you take your primary project for the week and make that the first a task related to that item. Now, there are a lot of good things that you can read about this method of doing regular writing. And so if you're going to take a picture of a slide, this would be the one to take it of. So the 2 books in particular are How to Write a Lot by Paul Sylvia. Somebody of you may know that book. Make sure you always get the second. Don't read the first edition, read the second one. And write no matter what. Paul Sylvia's first edition was written before he had children. And then he had children. And so the second book is way better. He used to say, schedule 8 from 10 o'clock today, every day for writing, and don't let anybody interrupt you. And I threw the book away when I read that. But his second edition is better. And then the bottom 2, Deep Work, which is a lot about time blocking and thinking about writing. And then The Now Habit is a good book that addresses it has good strategies for academic procrastination. So please let me know if you have other tips or methods, things that you do, or any questions at all. Please just send them along. Thanks.